everybody, this is Scott Allen Miller. Today on Sam IT, I'm going to talk about a little thing I had in a discussion today online about exactly what is a NAS versus a traditional file server. And this actually becomes really confusing because NAS is an incredibly stupid name, it turns out. So let's start at the beginning. What is a file server? So when we have servers, they do different things, and one of the most popular ones is file servers. They're simply a service that provides a network file system for other machines to consume. It's pretty basic, and most people know it from the Windows world as simply like map drives or remote shares. In the Unix world, we typically use NFS for these things. In the Apple world, you may be familiar with Apple File Sharing Protocol, AFP, or today they use SMB from the Windows world. There's lots of protocols that do this, and in some ways, your FTP or even web servers may be considered a file server, but it's a very simple service that our computers do and have done for a very, very long time. People remember lots of products trying to make these things work, like Novell back in the 80s and 90s. At some point, somebody wanted to take file servers, which is probably in the early days of servers, the most popular kind of server. Today, of course, we have email servers, web servers, application servers, database servers. I could go on and on. There's millions of things that happen on servers. But file serving at some point was basically the main purpose of servers. It quickly became more broad, but this is where we started, and for a really long time, decades even, this was the most important service that we would have on servers. It's what we focused around. If you were taking IT training in the mid-1990s and you were learning about things you could do on a server, you would spend almost all of your time learning about file servers and file server protocols and how to manage them. So it's not surprising that early on someone decided to start building appliances, that is, completely packaged systems that are managed by your vendor and are basically black boxes, as we described in another video just a couple days ago. It's not surprising that taking a file server and making it into an appliance was an early thing that people did and was really the first major appliance to get a lot of traction in the IT industry. What's interesting or weird or horrible is that in doing this, that early server became known as a NAS when a file server was turned into an appliance, instead of calling it a file server appliance. I have no idea why this happened or who thought it was a good marketing idea, but it worked really well. NAS became seen as kind of magic, and people kind of got this idea that they were this really special animal that did all this really important stuff when a file server was actually the simplest thing that they ever did. And why would anyone need it to be an appliance when making a file server was so easy? And yet it became a huge thing. That's not to say anything bad about NAS vendors, because some of them, say NetApp for example, went out and did lots of great technology behind their NAS. But the concept of a NAS was so basic that really everyone should have been a little bit appalled that it even needed to exist. There's reasons why it does exist, and I use them myself, so I'm not mocking anyone for using them. They're often convenient. But the idea is a bit silly. We're taking something that is so trivial that many times we do it by accident with other servers, and taking it and putting it into an appliance to separate out everything else and make it really, really dedicated and simple. It's already pretty simple. Why did we need to do that? So anyway, what's weird is that we called it a NAS. Decades later, we started taking NAS software and applying it to the virtualization world by putting it into a VM. Instead of calling this a virtualized NAS or a virtualized virtualized file server appliance, we started calling it a VSA, which was just another virtual storage appliance, another stupid term kind of like NAS. So we had a generic term that we should have been using all along had we really paid close attention to what things were and not treated them like magic black boxes where we don't know what's going on under the hood. And through multiple iterations of this, we came up with these things that are very confusing to the industry. So this leads to an interesting problem. We've got some vendors like NetApp who really focus on making dedicated NASs still, and they're very high-end and they mostly make sense. But we have a lot of other NAS vendors like Synology and ReadyNAS and Buffalo and Thecus and QNAP and others who make things that they call a NAS but are not. They're kind of a NAS. They have file server functionality. But remember, to be a NAS, it must be an appliance that does nothing but file serving. If it does anything else, it's either not an appliance or it's not a dedicated file server. If either of those two things stops being true, it's not actually a NAS. It may act like a NAS, it may have NAS functionality, but the thing that makes it a NAS is that it isn't other things. What Synology and ReadyNAS and those kind of players do is they make unified storage where it acts like a NAS and it acts like a drive array, or SAN as people tend to call it, and does both on the same box. We still call this a NAS, we just say that it's a NAS when it's doing this one function and it's a SAN when it's doing this other function. All of those terms are wrong. It's not technically a SAN, it's a drive array, and it's not technically a NAS because it has other functionality going on. It's a file server. But it does all the things we expect of a NAS, so we keep calling it a NAS. To make it more confusing, these vendors market these products as a NAS, which makes people think that they're not a SAN, when in reality, they're not a NAS. Now, to be even more confusing, most of these vendors, and these specifically, then take these quote-unquote NAS products and start making them able to run generic, arbitrary, ad hoc server workloads. Now think about this. The thing that made them a NAS was that we took away general purpose server workloads from something, then contained it as an appliance and called it a NAS. If we put those general purpose workloads back in, that's maybe acting as a web server, or acting as an Active Directory server, or acting as a application server, or a Plex server, or a database server. All of these things are available for your Synology, ReadyNAS, Buffalo, Thecus, QNAP, all of these, they do these things. Some of them, like some of the high-end QNAPs, even have full virtualization hosts, so you can host other servers on top of your quote-unquote NAS. This borders on the insane. Obviously, these products are not NAS. They are general-purpose servers. They may qualify as an appliance still, although even in that case, we're starting to move into a category where they are so open and so able to be modified and managed and treated as not a black box that they may not even qualify technically as appliances, but we're going to give them a pass on that. But what we can't give them a pass on is that they are a NAS. They may act like a file server, they may be great file servers, and in many of these cases, these are products I like a lot. Synology and ReadyNAS specifically, I will recommend in many cases. But what I can't do is tell you that they're truly a NAS. What they are is a moderately appliance-sized, mostly general-purpose Linux server with a heavy focus and expected use case of being used as either a NAS or a disk array in a SAN scenario. So while we expect it to be a file server, it's not just a file server, it's a general purpose Linux server. You can run basically anything you want on them, and they're built to do so. They may expect you to use it like a NAS in many cases, hence the name, but when you actually open up the box and look inside and start using them, you realize that they, from the beginning, have intended them to be general purpose servers, and they do a lot of things. That's fine, and there may be really great cases where you want to go buy one of these products and use it as a general purpose server on which your entire network runs. Nothing wrong with that. We could discuss that even in some pattern workshops, but what we can't do is think of it as a NAS, because what it's become is a server, not a NAS. To be a NAS, I have to reiterate this, the only thing that made something a NAS was that we took away the ability to do anything that wasn't file server, and we made it an appliance. It must be both of those things. Today, true NAS almost don't exist, and where they do, they tend to be pretty expensive. There are exceptions to this, but they are pretty rare. Almost everything that people refer to as a NAS today is some form of unified storage, often a form of general computing, and almost never truly a NAS. So what's important is that functionality is file serving, not being a NAS. We often use the term NAS to simply mean we can serve files, but that's what the term file server is for. The correct use of the term NAS only applies to when there is nothing else. Why is there a word like that? We will never know. It must be marketing related. It should never exist in tech, but it does. That's what it means, and now, because you have that terminology, you have the power to understand why the word is there, when to use it, and to kind of have a good idea of when other people are misusing it, because we're all going to misuse it, including me, because we're going to refer to things like my Synology or my ReadyNAS as a NAS, because everyone else does, and we mostly know what each other means, but there are cases where we don't, and by understanding the terms, it makes it at least a little bit easier for us to communicate those things, and it helps us break down when people are veering off and talking about something that's not a NAS at all. And this is important because the things When people talk about limitations or how NAS behave, that has to refer to the technology and has to be relevant to file servers in general. If anybody says something about a NAS and how it behaves and it is not generally applicable to file servers, then it's incorrect, and it must be based on a myth or a misunderstanding. And very often that is the case. This semantic understanding helps us identify that mythology when it happens within IT, and it's extremely common with NAS, so it's a good place to look out for it. Thanks for joining me. Remember to like and subscribe, put your questions below, ask about what things that you found are a NAS, aren't a NAS, what you think might be, whether it's a file server, all that stuff. And if you want to sponsor us, you can do so on Patreon.